He served 2 tours overseas. He carried wounded men out of burning wreckage with his bare hands. And on the day he walked into Voss Tower wearing his only good suit, a billionaire looked him up and down, laughed, and told security to remove the homeless man from the lobby. What Nathaniel Voss didn't know was that the man he just humiliated in front of 100 cameras was the reason his own father was alive long enough to build the company Voss was standing in. By the end of this story, the truth wouldn't just embarrass a billionaire. It would bring his entire empire to its knees. Act 1. The lobby of Voss Tower smelled like new marble and old money. 90 floors of glass rose up into a gray morning sky, and at the base of it, a crowd had gathered for the grand reopening of the building's public atrium, cameras rolling, champagne already being poured for people who hadn't earned a single drop of it. Marcus Reeves stood near the back of that crowd in a suit he'd owned for 11 years. It still fit him the way it had the day he bought it, because Marcus didn't believe in wasting things, not clothes, not time, not people. He was 58 years old, broad-shouldered, gray touching his temples the way frost touches the edge of a window in early winter. He wasn't there for champagne. He was there because his nonprofit, a small veterans transition center 3 blocks away, had been formally invited to the ceremony as a community partner, a title someone in Voss's PR department had slapped onto a guest list without ever intending to mean it. Marcus had learned a long time ago that being invited and being welcome were 2 very different things. He didn't know it yet, but 31 years ago, in a country whose name barely mattered anymore, because the war itself had been forgotten by everyone except the men who fought in it, Marcus had knelt over a wounded soldier in a burning field and refused to let him die. That soldier's name was Walter Voss. And the empire rising above Marcus's head right now, 90 floors of steel and glass and unearned pride, existed because Walter Voss lived long enough to build it. Marcus didn't know that yet, but someone in that lobby was about to find out. Nathaniel Voss moved through the crowd the way he moved through everything, like the room existed to reflect him back at himself. 45 years old, tailored to the inch, a smile he'd practiced so many times in mirrors that it no longer looked practiced to anyone but the people who'd known him longest. He'd built his public story on one word: self-made. He said it in interviews. He said it in his own biography. He said it so often that he'd almost convinced himself the man whose blood ran through his veins had nothing to do with any of it. He saw Marcus standing near the back, still, calm, watching the room the way soldiers learn to watch rooms, and something about that stillness irritated him before he even understood why. "Excuse me," Voss said, loud enough for the cameras nearby to catch it. "Is someone going to explain why there's a man in a thrift store suit standing in my lobby?" The laughter that followed wasn't universal, but it was loud enough. Marcus felt it land the way he'd felt 100 small humiliations land before, not like a blow, but like a slow, familiar weight settling on his shoulders that had carried far worse. "I was invited," Marcus said quietly. "Community partner list. The Veterans Center on Ferris Street." Voss barely looked at the paper Marcus held out. "We get a lot of requests from people looking for a handout," he said, already turning to a nearby camera crew, already performing for them instead of speaking to the man in front of him. "Security, let's help our guest find the door. This is a business event, not a shelter." 2 security guards approached. Marcus didn't resist, didn't raise his voice, didn't give the cameras the reaction they were fishing for. He simply nodded once, turned, and walked out through the same glass doors he'd walked in through 20 minutes earlier, past a dozen phones filming a moment they didn't understand the weight of yet. Outside, the morning air was cold enough to sting. Marcus stood on the sidewalk for a moment, hands in his pockets, watching his own breath fog in front of him. This wasn't the first time. It wasn't even the 5th time this year a man in a suit had decided, in the space of 4 seconds, exactly what kind of man Marcus was. It was, if he was honest with himself, the kind of moment that used to make him angry. Now it just made him tired. He thought, briefly, of a burning field, of a young man's blood on his hands, of a promise made in a language neither of them had time to finish saying out loud. He hadn't thought about that day in years. He didn't know why it surfaced now, standing outside a glass tower built by a man who'd just called him homeless. He caught the bus back to Ferris Street. The Veterans Transition Center wasn't much to look at from the outside, a converted brick storefront with a hand-painted sign and a door that stuck in humid weather. Inside, it was warmer than the building deserved to be, filled with mismatched furniture, a coffee pot that never fully turned off, and a corkboard covered in photographs of men and women who had walked in broken and walked out, eventually, with somewhere to stand. Dana Whitfield Combs was already there when Marcus walked in, sorting through a stack of manila folders with the particular ferocity of a woman running out of time and refusing to admit it. 34, sharp-eyed, fiercely protective of the center and of Marcus in equal measure. She looked up the moment the door creaked. "You're back early," she said. "How was the Billionaire Zoo?" "About what you'd expect." She studied his face for a second longer than the joke deserved. "What happened?" "Nothing that hasn't happened before." Dana didn't push. Not yet, because she'd learned that Marcus told you things when he was ready and not a second before. Instead, she slid a folder across the desk toward him. "This came for you. Lease renewal notice." "Well, non-renewal notice, technically." Marcus opened the folder and read it twice before setting it down. The building's owner, a shell company 2 layers removed from anyone with a name Marcus recognized, had declined to renew their lease past the end of the quarter. 90 days. 90 days to find a new home for a program that currently served 41 veterans, including a 26-year-old former Army mechanic named Elena Cruz who had walked into this building 8 months ago on a prosthetic leg. She hadn't yet learned to trust and who was, as of 2 weeks ago, walking without her cane for the first time since her injury. 90 days, Marcus said, mostly to himself. "I already called the housing office. I called the city council rep. I called everybody who owes us a favor and half the people who don't." Dana's voice had the particular edge of someone who'd spent the whole day being told no in increasingly polite ways. "Marcus, if we don't find funding or a new location by the end of the quarter, we don't have a program. We have 41 people we sent home with nowhere to go." Marcus looked at the corkboard, at Elena's photograph pinned in the corner, at a dozen other faces who'd trusted this place with the hardest parts of themselves. He thought again, unbidden, of a burning field decades ago, of the promise he'd made and never had reason to think about again. "We'll figure it out," he said. "We always have." But even as he said it, something in his chest told him this time might be different. He just didn't yet know how different. If you're just joining us, make sure you hit subscribe right now, because what happens next is going to change everything Marcus thought he knew about that morning in the lobby, and you will not want to miss it. Here's a question for you before we move forward. If you'd been in that lobby and watched a stranger get humiliated like that, would you have said something? Let me know in the comments below. Act 2. The public hearing was scheduled for a Tuesday morning in a municipal building that smelled like industrial cleaner and old paperwork. Marcus arrived early, wearing the same suit, because it was the only suit he owned that fit the moment. Dana sat beside him with a binder thick enough to stop a bullet. 3 years of the center's outcomes documented in careful, exhausting detail, job placements, sobriety milestones, reduced recidivism among veterans who'd cycled through the justice system before finding their way to Ferris Street. None of it mattered in the way she'd hoped it would. Voss's legal team arrived with a different kind of binder, thinner, colder, filled with zoning language and development projections and phrases like highest and best use of the property that managed to make 41 human beings sound like a rounding error. Their lead attorney, a woman named Corinne Vale, dismantled Dana's testimony point by point, not with cruelty, but with the flat, practiced efficiency of someone who had done this 100 times and would do it 100 more. And then Nathaniel Voss himself stood to speak, because apparently this mattered enough to him personally to make an appearance. "I understand emotions are high," he said, addressing the small commission with the same performative warmth he'd worn in the lobby 3 days earlier. "But let's be clear about what's actually happening here. This is a block that's been economically stagnant for a decade. My company is proposing $400 million in new development, new jobs, new tax revenue for this city. And we're being asked to delay that because of..." He glanced, deliberately, toward Marcus' sentiment. Marcus felt Dana stiffen beside him. "I recognize you," Voss added, almost as an afterthought, loud enough for the room. "The lobby. Community partner. Was it?" A small, cold smile. "I have to say, I admire the persistence. Some people really do believe if they show up in the right building enough times, someone will finally listen." A ripple of uncomfortable laughter moved through part of the room. Marcus didn't move, didn't blink, didn't give Voss the reaction the man was clearly hunting for. He simply stood when it was his turn to speak, and in a voice that had once given orders in far worse rooms than this one, he said, "I'm not here for sentiment, Mr. Voss. I'm here for the 26-year-old who walked into my center 8 months ago and couldn't cross a room without a cane, and who walked 3 blocks on her own 2 weeks ago for the first time since she lost part of her leg overseas. I'm here for the 40 other veterans who found somewhere to stand after their own country stopped looking for them. You can call that sentiment if it makes the demolition easier to sign off on. I call it the only kind of return on investment that's ever mattered to me." The room was quiet in a different way after that. Not won over. The commission would still take the matter under advisement, which everyone in the room understood was bureaucratic language for probably yes eventually. But quiet in the way rooms go when something true has been said out loud and no one quite knows what to do with it. Voss's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. He hadn't expected the man from the lobby to speak like that. It unsettled him more than he wanted to admit, and unsettled men, Marcus had learned a long time ago, often become dangerous men. Elena Cruz was waiting outside the building when the hearing let out, standing without her cane, the late morning sun catching the edge of her prosthetic below the hem of her jeans. She was 26 years old with a jaw that set hard when she was scared and trying not to show it, which was most of the time these days. "How'd it go?" she asked, though the look on Dana's face already told her most of the answer. "We're not out yet," Marcus said. "But it's close." Elena nodded slowly, looking down at the sidewalk. "I finally called my mom last week. Told her about the program, about walking again. First real conversation we've had in 2 years." Her voice caught slightly. "If this place closes, I don't know where I go, Marcus. I don't know who I am without this place yet. I'm not finished becoming whoever I'm supposed to be." Marcus put a hand on her shoulder, the same hand that had once pressed against a stranger's wound in a burning field. "You let me worry about the building," he said. "You keep walking." It was the kind of promise Marcus had made before and always found a way to keep, but even as the words left his mouth, he felt, for the first time in a long time, genuinely unsure whether he could. That same afternoon, a young journalist named Priya Nair sat in the back corner of a nearly empty coffee shop with her laptop open to a folder of half-formed notes. She'd covered Nathaniel Voss for 2 years now, first as a business reporter chasing quarterly earnings, then increasingly as something else, a woman who'd noticed the same pattern too many times to call it coincidence. The way Voss's public self-made narrative never quite lined up with the scattered, buried details of his father Walter Voss's early business dealings, details that seemed to vanish from public record every time someone got close to them. She didn't have a story yet. She had a feeling, and feelings didn't get published. But feelings, she'd learned, were often where every real story started. She typed a note to herself. Walter Voss military records, sealed or missing. Why? She didn't know yet that 3 blocks away, in a converted brick storefront on Ferris Street, a man named Marcus Rees was about to become the answer to a question she hadn't even fully asked. Back at the center that evening, Dana was digging through an old filing cabinet in the back office, looking for insurance paperwork that predated her employment there, when she found a folder that didn't belong. Yellowed at the edges, tucked behind years of unrelated documents, it contained a single handwritten letter, the ink faded but legible, dated decades earlier. It was addressed to Marcus by name, and it was signed, at the bottom, in a shaking hand, W. Voss. Dana read it twice before she understood she didn't understand it at all. She didn't know who W. Voss was to Marcus, or why a man with that last name would have written him a letter that read, in part, "I don't know how a man repays a debt like this one. I intend to find a way." She set it aside to ask him about later, not realizing she was holding the first thread of a truth that was about to unravel an empire. Meanwhile, inside a boardroom on the 62nd floor of Voss Tower, Nathaniel Voss was fighting a very different battle. His board, led by a sharp-tongued investor named Reginald Okafor, was questioning the pace of his expansion, the amount of debt the company had taken on to fund 4 simultaneous developments, including the one slated for Ferris Street. "You're over-leveraged, Nathaniel," Okafor said flatly. "And you're generating bad press over a demolition that's turning into a PR headache instead of a groundbreaking. A veterans center, of all things. Do you understand what that looks like in the news cycle right now?" "It looks like progress," Voss said, though his voice carried less certainty than it had in the lobby days earlier. "It looks," Okafor said, "like a man trying so hard to prove he built something from nothing that he's willing to bulldoze anything that reminds people his father built the foundation first." The room went silent. Voss said nothing, but something in his expression cracked, just slightly, just long enough for anyone paying close attention to see the insecurity underneath the tailored suit and the practiced smile. He'd spent his whole life trying to outrun his father's shadow. He didn't yet know how literally that shadow was about to catch up to him. That night, alone in his office long after the building had emptied out, Marcus sat at his desk with Dana's mysterious folder in front of him, the letter signed W. Voss lying open under the desk lamp. He read it once, then again, and slowly, the pieces of a memory he'd buried for 31 years began to surface. A burning field, a wounded stranger, a promise neither of them had time to finish. He didn't sleep that night. Somewhere in the city, a truth was waking up after 3 decades of silence, and it was about to change everything. If this story has you on the edge of your seat already, now is the time to hit that subscribe button, because Act 3 is where everything Marcus thought he knew gets turned upside down. Here's a question for you. Have you ever discovered something about your own past that changed how you understood your entire life? Drop your story in the comments. I read every single one. Act 3. Harold Whitfield was 73 years old and had spent the last 4 decades as legal counsel first to Walter Voss and, reluctantly, in the years since Walter's death, to Nathaniel. He'd watched the son inherit the father's ambition without inheriting the father's conscience, and it had troubled him more than he'd ever said out loud, because saying it out loud came with consequences he'd been too comfortable to accept. That comfort ended the day he heard the name Marcus Reeves mentioned in passing by a junior associate, in connection with a demolition dispute on Ferris Street. He hadn't heard that name in 31 years. He'd hoped, in some quiet corner of himself, that he never would again, not because he wanted to forget it, but because the name carried a debt he'd watched Walter Voss spend the last years of his life trying and failing to properly repay. Whitfield found Marcus at the center 2 days later, standing awkwardly in the doorway of a building he clearly wasn't used to entering. An old man in an expensive coat looking distinctly out of place among the mismatched furniture and the corkboard full of photographs. "Mr. Reeves," he said, "my name is Harold Whitfield. I was Walter Voss's attorney. I think it's time someone told you the truth about a debt that's gone unpaid for 31 years. What followed was a conversation that reshaped everything Marcus thought he understood about his own life. 31 years earlier, in a helicopter crash during a joint operation overseas, a young officer named Walter Voss had been thrown clear of the wreckage, alive but barely, bleeding out in a field that was actively burning around him. Marcus, a combat medic 27 years old at the time, had run into that fire when every instinct and every ounce of training told him not to. He'd packed the wound, dragged Walter nearly 200 yards to an extraction point, and kept pressure on a bleed that should have killed the man 3 separate times before help arrived. Walter Voss survived. Marcus, reassigned within weeks, transferred out of the unit, never learned the man's name well enough to remember it, and Walter, delirious with blood loss for most of the encounter, never got the chance to properly thank the medic who saved him until years later, when a record search finally connected the name to the memory. "Walter spent the last 15 years of his life trying to find you," Whitfield said. "Not for sentiment, for something he considered a debt of honor. Before you ask, yes, that includes the founding shares of the shell company that eventually became Voss Holdings. Walter set aside a trust in your name decades ago, Mr. Reeves. 10% equity, non-voting until formally activated, meant to be transferred to you the day we located you. Walter died before the transfer was finalized. And Nathaniel," Whitfield paused, choosing his next words with visible difficulty, "Nathaniel found the paperwork years ago and buried it." Marcus sat perfectly still, the way he'd learned to sit still in far worse moments than this one. "Buried it," he repeated. "Why?" "Because the story of a black combat medic saving his father's life and being owed a tenth of the empire Nathaniel calls self-made doesn't fit the narrative he's spent 20 years building. He knew fragments of it, enough to be afraid of it. Not enough, I suspect, to understand the full shape of what he was hiding." Marcus thought of Elena Cruz walking 3 blocks without her cane. He thought of Terrence, his own son, who'd stopped calling 2 years ago because Marcus had spent so many years pouring himself into strangers that his own family had learned to stop waiting for him to notice they needed him too. He thought of a burning field he hadn't let himself remember in decades, and a young officer's face he could barely picture anymore, except for the sound of his own voice telling him, over and over, "Stay with me, stay with me. You are not dying today." "I don't want his money," Marcus said quietly. "I understand," Whitfield said. "But I'd ask you to consider what that money, and more importantly, that truth, could do for the people in this building. Because I don't think Nathaniel is going to stop with a demolition notice, Mr. Reeves. I think when he realizes how close this truth is to surfacing, he's going to move faster and harder than any of us are prepared for." He wasn't wrong. Across the city, Billionaire had finally found the thread she'd been chasing for 2 years. A retired Army records clerk, contacted through a long chain of sources, confirmed off the record that a formal commendation request involving Walter Voss's rescue had been filed decades earlier and then mysteriously withdrawn, the paperwork sealed at the request of family counsel. It wasn't proof of everything yet, but it was proof that something had been deliberately hidden, and for a journalist like Priya, that was often the loudest signal of all. She didn't know Marcus's name yet, but she was 3 days away from finding it. Terrence Reeves showed up at the center unannounced on a Thursday evening, the way he sometimes did when guilt outweighed pride, which wasn't often, but happened just enough to keep a thread of relationship alive between him and his father. He was 29, sharp-jawed like Marcus, carrying a resentment that had calcified over years of feeling like second priority to strangers in uniform. He found Marcus in the back office, staring at an old letter under a desk lamp, looking older than Terrence had ever seen him look. "You okay, Dad?" Marcus looked up, and for the first time in longer than either of them could remember, he didn't try to hide what he was feeling. "I found out something today," he said slowly. "About who I used to be. About a promise someone made me that I never knew about." He told Terrence the story, the field, the fire, Walter Voss, the buried trust, all of it, and watched his son's face shift through disbelief, then anger, then something that looked almost like pride, an expression Terrence hadn't worn around his father in years. "You saved a man's life, and he built an empire, and his son tried to erase you from the story," Terrence said quietly. "Dad, that's not just unfair. That's theft. It's more complicated than that." "Is it?" Terrence's voice cracked slightly. "You spent my whole childhood telling me that doing the right thing mattered more than being recognized for it. And now the one-time recognition actually matters, actually has power behind it, power that could save this center, save Elena, save 40 other people. You're going to walk away from it because it's uncomfortable?" Marcus didn't have an answer ready, not because Terrence was wrong, but because for the first time in a long time, his son was looking at him the way he used to, before the years of distance, before the quiet resentment. And that, more than any trust fund or equity stake, was the thing Marcus realized he'd been missing most. "I'm not walking away," Marcus said finally. "I'm deciding how to walk toward it." The next morning, Voss received a call from a source inside the city zoning office that made the blood drain from his face. A journalist had been asking questions about sealed military records connected to his father. He didn't yet know it was Priya. He didn't yet know it connected to Marcus. But he knew, with the particular instinct of a man who has spent his whole life protecting a fragile story, that time was running out. He picked up the phone and gave an order that would accelerate the Ferris Street demolition timeline by 6 weeks, hoping to erase the building and the story tied to it before anyone had the chance to connect the dots. He had no idea he was about to hand Marcus exactly the leverage and exactly the reason to finally step forward. If you've made it this far, you already know this story is about to hit its turning point, and trust me, you do not want to miss what happens next. Hit subscribe now so you don't lose your place. Here's a question for you. If you found out someone had hidden a truth that could change your entire life, would you come forward immediately or take time to decide how? Let me know below. Act 4. The press conference was scheduled for a Monday morning at the base of Voss Tower, the same lobby where Marcus had been publicly humiliated weeks earlier, now dressed up with a podium, a step-and-repeat banner, and a crowd of reporters gathered to hear Nathaniel Voss announce the accelerated groundbreaking of his newest development, the one that required the demolition of a small brick building 3 blocks away. Voss stood at the podium in a suit even more tailored than the one he'd worn before, practiced smile fixed in place, ready to spin a story about progress and vision to a room full of cameras. He didn't see Marcus enter until it was too late to control the room. Marcus walked in flanked by Harold Whitfield on one side and Dana on the other, wearing the same suit he'd worn to the lobby weeks earlier, the same suit Voss had once called a thrift store costume. This time, he didn't stop near the back of the crowd. He walked directly toward the podium, and something in his posture, calm, unhurried, utterly unafraid, made the room's energy shift before he'd said a single word. "Mr. Voss," Marcus said, his voice carrying easily across the marble lobby without needing to be raised. "Before you continue, I think there's something the people in this room deserve to know." Voss's smile faltered. "Security." "Before you call security again," Whitfield interrupted, stepping forward with a leather folder in hand, "I'd strongly advise you reconsider, Nathaniel. I'm your father's attorney. I'm also, as of this morning, representing Mr. Reeves. And I have documentation your legal team is going to want to see before you say another word to this room." The cameras that had been trained on Voss's podium slowly began redirecting, reporters sensing, with the particular hunger of people who live for exactly this kind of moment, that the real story had just walked in wearing a suit that had been mocked weeks earlier for not looking expensive enough. At that exact moment, phones across the room began buzzing. Billionaire's article had just gone live, headlined blunt and unflinching. "Sealed records reveal Voss family concealed war heroes rescue and a buried fortune." She hadn't known Marcus would be standing in this lobby when she hit publish. She'd simply followed the truth as far as it would go, and it had led her, almost by accident, to this exact moment. The room dissolved into a low roar of whispered questions and shifting cameras. 31 years ago, Marcus said, his voice steady even as the room around him fractured into chaos, "I pulled a wounded man out of a burning field. I didn't know his name for years. I didn't know what became of him. I certainly didn't know he'd go on to build the company standing behind you right now, Mr. Voss. Your father spent the last years of his life trying to find me, to repay a debt he considered sacred. He set aside a trust in my name. And somewhere along the way, you found that paperwork. And instead of honoring your father's wishes, you buried it, because a story where a black medic saved your family's fortune didn't fit the version of yourself you wanted the world to believe." "That is not," Voss started, but his voice cracked in a way it never had in front of cameras before, the performance he'd spent 20 years perfecting finally, publicly, failing him. Reginald Okafor, standing near the edge of the boardroom's delegation, folded his arms, watching his CEO unravel with the flat, unsurprised expression of a man who had suspected something like this was coming for longer than he'd admitted. "Mr. Whitfield," a reporter called out, "can you confirm the validity of this trust? I drafted it myself, at Walter Voss's explicit instruction, 14 years ago," Whitfield said clearly, "for the cameras, for the record, for history. It is entirely valid. And it has gone unhonored for far longer than it should have." Voss stood frozen at the podium, the empire he'd built his entire identity around cracking open in real time, in front of every camera he'd ever courted for a friendlier story. For the first time in longer than he could remember, Nathaniel Voss had absolutely nothing rehearsed to say. 20 minutes later, after the press conference had dissolved into a chaos of follow-up questions and hastily issued corporate statements, Voss found Marcus alone near the same spot where he'd once ordered security to remove him. "Why now?" Voss asked, and for the first time, there was no performance in his voice at all, just something raw and exhausted underneath it. "You could have exposed this years ago if you'd known." "I didn't know," Marcus said simply. "I'm not here for revenge, Nathaniel. I never was. I'm here because 41 veterans are 3 weeks away from losing the only place that's ever treated them like they still matter, and you were about to bulldoze it to protect a story that was never true to begin with." Voss was quiet for a long moment, something shifting behind his eyes that looked almost, though not quite, like his father's face in old photographs Whitfield had shown him once. Years ago, photographs of a man who'd apparently spent his final years trying to make something right instead of protecting his own image. "My father talked about you," Voss said quietly. "Near the end. I didn't understand who he meant. I thought it was just old man talk. Guilt he never explained." "It wasn't guilt," Marcus said. "It was gratitude he never got to finish saying out loud." Voss looked down at the marble floor beneath his $900 shoes, the same floor Marcus had been escorted across weeks earlier by security guards following his orders. "What do you want from me?" Voss asked. "I want you to save the center," Marcus said. "Permanently. I want you to make sure Elena Cruz and 40 other veterans have somewhere to stand. And I want you to finally tell the truth about how your family's fortune actually started, not for me, for your father. He spent 15 years trying to make this right. Let him finish." If this moment gave you chills, imagine how it felt to write it. And if you want more stories like this one, hit subscribe now, because the resolution is coming up next, and it is worth every second of the wait. Here's a question for you. Do you think Nathaniel deserves a real chance to change, or has he lost that chance for good? Let me know what you think in the comments. Act 5. The weeks that followed moved faster than Marcus had expected, and slower than the city's news cycle demanded, which was, he supposed, the way most real change actually happened, somewhere in the uncomfortable space between a headline and a lasting decision. Whitfield finalized the equity transfer within days, the 10% stake in Voss Holdings that Walter had set aside decades earlier finally, formally, undeniably becoming Marcus's. Marcus didn't take a public victory lap. He didn't do a single interview beyond the one he owed Priya, whose reporting had, in its own quiet way, forced the truth into daylight faster than any lawsuit could have. The first thing Marcus did with the money was buy the Ferris Street building outright, ending the lease dispute permanently and putting the deed in the name of the nonprofit itself, so that no future landlord, no future Voss, could ever hold the building hostage again. The second thing he did was expand Elena Cruz's recovery program into a full-time position, hiring her as the center's first peer support coordinator, a job that let her spend her days doing exactly what she'd once been afraid she'd never have the strength to do again, walking alongside someone else through the hardest part of coming home. "You did this," Elena told him, the day she signed her offer letter, sitting in the same chair she'd once sat in with a cane she no longer needed. "You did this," Marcus corrected. "I just made sure the building stayed standing long enough for you to finish." Terrence started showing up more often after that, not out of guilt anymore, but out of something that had quietly rebuilt itself between them over the course of a few difficult, honest conversations. He began volunteering at the center 2 evenings a week, helping veterans navigate job applications, something he was good at and had never had the chance to be good at in front of his father before. "I used to think you loved strangers more than you loved me," Terrence admitted one evening, restocking the center's small supply closet alongside Marcus. "I never did," Marcus said. "I just didn't know how to show you both at the same time. I'm still learning." "Yeah," Terrence said, and for the first time in years, he smiled at his father without any distance behind it. "Me too." Nathaniel Voss's transformation wasn't loud, and it wasn't complete, because real change rarely is either of those things. He didn't hold a redemption press conference. He didn't perform an apology tour for cameras the way he'd once performed everything else. He simply showed up, 3 weeks after the press conference, alone, at the door of the Ferris Street Center, in a plain coat instead of a tailored suit, and asked if he could see the building his father had spent the last years of his life quietly trying to protect. Marcus let him in. They didn't talk long. Voss looked at the corkboard full of photographs, at Elena's picture pinned in the corner, at the mismatched furniture and the coffee pot that never fully turned off, and something in his face, for the first time since Marcus had met him, looked less like a man performing confidence and more like a man beginning, slowly, to understand what his father had actually valued. "He kept a photo of you," Voss said quietly, not looking at Marcus. "In his desk drawer. I found it after he died. I didn't know who you were. I just knew he looked at it sometimes, when he thought no one was watching." Marcus didn't say anything to that. He didn't need to. Some truths didn't require a response, only space to finally exist out loud. Voss stayed for 20 minutes. He didn't fix anything that day, and he didn't need to. Repair, Marcus had learned a long time ago, rarely happens all at once. It happens in small, uncomfortable visits like this one, repeated, slowly, until trust has somewhere honest to stand. Priya's follow-up article ran 2 weeks later, quieter than her first, focused not on scandal but on outcome. A veteran sinner saved. A young woman named Elena Cruz building a career out of her own recovery. A company beginning, tentatively, to reckon honestly with the story of how it started. It didn't go as viral as the first story had. Priya didn't mind. Some stories mattered more for what they built than for what they broke. On a Sunday afternoon months later, the center held a small gathering. Nothing formal, just coffee and folding chairs and 40-some people who had, in one way or another, found somewhere to stand again. Elena walked across the room without her cane, without a single hitch in her step, laughing at something Dana had said, and Marcus watched her from across the room with the particular quiet pride of a man who had spent his whole life giving pieces of himself away to strangers and had finally, slowly, learned he was allowed to feel proud of where those pieces landed. Terence stood beside him, arms crossed, watching the same scene. "You ever think about what would have happened if you hadn't gone to that opening?" Terence asked. "If Voss hadn't humiliated you in that lobby?" Marcus thought about it for a long moment. "I think the truth would have found its way out eventually," he said. "It usually does. It just needed somewhere safe to land first." He wore his old field jacket that afternoon, not because he had to, not because he needed to prove anything to anyone in that room, but because it still fit him the way it always had, and because some things, he'd learned, weren't meant to be replaced just because the world around them finally changed. In the end, this was never really a story about a billionaire's humiliation, or even about the fortune that came after it. It was a story about what happens when the truth is finally given room to breathe, about a promise made in a burning field 31 years ago that took 3 decades to finish, and about a man who never once demanded to be seen, and was seen anyway, exactly when it mattered most. If this story moved you even half as much as it moved me telling it, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button. Drop a comment below letting me know which moment hit you hardest, and share this with someone who needs a reminder today that the truth always finds its way home. Thank you for watching all the way to the end. I'll see you in the next story.